Hello, could you tell us your name, your background, and how you can relate to the concept Love Thy Neighbor?
Okay. I'm Liz Bounds. I am Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at the Candler School of Theology and the Graduate Division of Religion. That means I teach master's students and doctoral students. Before that, I actually taught undergraduates, just FYI, in religious studies at Virginia Tech. I am a practicing Christian. I was not raised Christian, however, which is, I wasn't raised anything, so I actually have a lot of connection to people now. That's a much more common phenomenon, but I grew up in New York City where they got an early start on the nuns. N-O-N-E-S is a hot category in religion right now, that there's rising numbers of people in the United States who are no religion, or the nuns, as they're called. But I chose to be Christian and am Christian and work at a Christian school. And my topic area is, I worked at the National Council of Churches, an ecumenical organization, and then I also obviously went on and did my Master's of Divinity and doctorate and in Christian ethics. But you wanted to know why I cared about love thy neighbor. Well, it is one of the foundational teachings in Christian scripture. And because it's so foundational, it means that it usually can be misunderstood, misappropriated, distorted, twisted, and done all sorts of crazy things with, and it has been that. But it is foundational in a couple of places in the New Testament. That is the foundational Holy Scripture for Christians, the Gospels and the writings of attributed to Paul. When Jesus is asked, says a couple of different times that there are only two great commandments: love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. That's it. The whole. I mean, everything is supposed to be summed up in that teaching. And as always, for something that central and that simple, really, it's actually extraordinarily and profoundly difficult. And so what does it mean to love thy neighbor? Well, one of the things that you have to think about a lot is, well, what does the love mean? And clearly, Jesus linked loving God, loving neighbor, and loving self. That love is supposed to be common among all three of those, that triumvirate: God, neighbor, and self. And love is a hard word, and there's a lot of, actually, English doesn't have all the translations. Greek does. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of love, shades of love in the Greek language, which is the language the New Testament was written in. Examples would be eros, philia, agape. The love that is being discussed in these teachings is agape, which has been a central concept in Christianity and vastly distorted in many, many ways. Agape has been usually translated as a kind of self-giving love. And that's been linked to Jesus' self-giving love in his crucifixion and then resurrection, obviously central to Christian teachings. But that has led to see that love as a complete self-sacrificing love, a teaching that has been particularly negative when it's been used with minorities and marginalized persons and women, so that it could justify, I don't need to have any self at all, I just give it all up. Well, no, because you got to go back and say, what does Jesus say? Love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. You don't love yourself by complete self-denial and self-annihilation. It is a love that is to reproduce, to bring about on earth the love that God has for all creation. And that love is not a self-emptying love. That love is a fulfilling love. It's love that wants the best for the other. It is a love that wants to share in the suffering of the other. I think Christianity has been helped by the new, more recent interests in Buddhist notions of compassion. And that is one way you could translate that love, is compassion. That would be one way of talking about it. But, so what does it mean, love mean? It means having compassion for oneself and for others, mirroring the compassion God has towards us. But then there's the neighbor part. Every religious system has strictures about how we are to treat others. Originally would have been probably others within our group, because you've got to have rules about how you treat others and fix things in your group, or your group dissolves out of conflict and so forth. So, but there is something more. It's present in Judaism, and it gets picked up in Christianity and in other religions, but let me just focus on Christianity, that neighbor is not necessarily the one that is in your group or your community. Judaism understood that you had obligations to the stranger. But what Jesus does is underline that even further by the way that he tells the commandments. The commandments are set up in Luke, or else Luke tells it this way, since Luke was the writer of the gospel. After Jesus in Luke says, love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, the person he's discussing it with says, but teacher, who is my neighbor? And that's when Jesus tells the very famous parable of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan, in the story, there's a man beat up lying on the road, and a Levite and a priest walk by and ignore that person. And the Samaritan comes along, and he gathers him up, and he binds his wounds, and he takes him to the nearest hostelry, and he leaves money to make sure he's taken care of. And then Jesus, at the end of the parable, turns back to the guy questioning him and says, so now who was the neighbor? And the man says, the one who had mercy. And Jesus says, yes. But it's really important to understand what Jesus' hearers would have heard in that story. His primary hearers in the origins of Christianity were other Jews. And a priest and a Levite were persons of authority, respectable persons. It would be like, every comparison I might bring to our own time will probably be politically loaded. So let's just say really authoritative people. And they ignore this person. Part of the reason they ignore this person is that they're afraid that they'll be defiled by him, that he is unclean in some way. And you can imagine, there are a good number of parallels in our own, we can imagine to that. But when Jesus' hearers hear about the Samaritan who's going down the road, they're shocked, because they do not like Samaritans. It would be the equivalent that would be closer to where we are politically right now is if you had a really nice Christian pastor pass by the guy, another really nice Christian leader pass by the guy, and then the Muslim comes along and rescues the guy in a context that we are in right now, where there is a lot of hostility towards Muslims in our country. Some of Jesus' hearers would have had that kind of reaction. Like, this person is doing it? This person is a bad person. This person is our enemy, and this person is doing it. So the brilliance of what this parable does, it not only enjoins that you must have mercy to those that are suffering around you, it also suggests that the person who really understands mercy is not one of your kind at all. It's a person that you would have called an enemy. That is really, to me, one of the most powerful underminings and resources in Christianity to insist that we cannot make others enemies, that everybody is our neighbor. Because in the context Jesus told the story, that Samaritan would never have been seen as any kind of person to see positively within your own community. But the Samaritan is the one who actually does what the faithful should do. So that to me is why that notion of neighbor love is so important. It is not just being nice by any means. And it's not being nice to those who are around you. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but that's actually the challenge of that teaching in Christianity. Is it is being compassionate and connected to anybody as you can, even people that you think you don't like or that you think are your enemies.
Great. Yeah, can we cut? Okay, so you touched on who our neighbors are and what it means to be a neighbor. So why is it so important to love a neighbor in today's time?
Well, you can take it a bunch of different ways. If I was taking it from the perspective of someone who is a practicing Christian, it's clearly because it is commanded to you. It's one of the central cores of the tradition that has been given to you. So, but I would also say, not necessarily speaking from Christian tradition, that as we live in a world where we have to, the world that the scriptures come out of, there was a lot of violence, but I mean that, you know, that other would be, the Samaritans weren't that far. I mean, you know, they were just kind of down the road. I mean, it wasn't that you had to go over the hills and across the Mediterranean to get to the Samaritans. But in the kind of world we live in today, all sorts of people we are connecting with in all sorts of ways. And so that the assumptions that people grew up with, that in some parts of the United States, that, you know, everybody looks like everybody else, and, you know, our neighbor is that nice person across the street. Well, the neighbor still is your nice person across the street, but your neighbor may be all these other people that you connect with. I'm helped by this, frankly, by having grown up in New York City, where that's, to me, I think, what allows me to think about this in context of my own Christianity. Because in New York City, you interacted at various levels with all sorts of different people all the time. And you would not have to see them as negative. I've found the most unexpected helpfulness from New Yorkers, contrary to all stereotypes, in all sorts of situations, you know, with a vast plurality of people, types of people. I think that for our survival, we have to love our neighbor. I think that we are called, if we're in various traditions, to love our neighbor. I think even as citizens of the world, we have to love and care about our neighbors, because we are not going to survive unless we do.
Great. And if you could remember to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that.
Totally fine. How do you love people who do horrible things?
How do you love people who do horrible things? I have pretty good experience about this because I spend some part of my life administering a program for incarcerated women up in Arundel, Georgia. And the chaplain there often says something. We have students placed there, among other things, but and the chaplain always likes to quote something that Sister Helen Prejean said, if you've ever seen Dead Man Walking or read Dead Man Walking. And Sister Helen says that a person is always more than the worst thing that they've done. And that is absolutely the truth. I have spent time with women who have done horrible things. Sometimes one of the reasons that they've done horrible things is that, in fact, there was no love shown to them. That's not the only reason, but that can be a reason. And that I have never known a woman there that I did not think could be loved. I think there may be a few people somewhere in our prison systems who are pretty bad, and that might be really tough to do that. But if you look at someone I've never met a person that I've thought was so other than me, that I haven't seen the connections, or I haven't seen that, you know, and once you see that there is a relation, I think love becomes fairly natural. It is quite possible to love someone who has done horrible things. And, you know, it may be because that's the way you are, or it also may be because they have changed and they have dealt with the fact that they have done horrible things. I knew the woman who was executed a couple of years ago on the death row in Georgia, Kelly Gissendaner, who had done a horrible thing. She conspired with her then boyfriend to murder her husband, then husband. But Kelly wasn't the same person that when she was the same person, but she had also grown a great deal and asked for forgiveness and was remorseful for what she had done and had tried to grow herself and become a different person. And that's something else to think about when you are thinking about loving someone who's done horrible things. They may not, the person who did that is not, as back to Helen, Sister Helen, is not all, usually almost always, I was one, there may be an exception, but I can't think of one right now, is always more than what they did.
How do you love people who reject Jesus being the Son of God?
Well, how do you love people that reject Jesus being the Son of God? I actually have never thought about that. That's not a requirement. Though I know for some people who are Christians, that is a requirement. One of the ways to think about that comes from a somewhat famous Christian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran pastor in Germany, and he ended up in the anti-Hitler underground and was arrested for a plot to assassinate Hitler. And while in prison, he wrote some very extraordinary letters. And one of the things he said was that in his work in the underground, he often found that the people who were not religious at all, like many people in the underground movements, were better Christians than most of the Christians he knew, which is kind of what I think many days. That means that whatever Jesus was talking about when Jesus said the way to the Father, using that traditional language, the way to God is through me, that has been traditionally interpreted to mean that means you have to be a Christian. I don't think so, personally. I don't think that's what it means. It means something different. It means probably acting, being, following. I think that's what Bonhoeffer was thinking, doing the things, acting the way Jesus acted. And that didn't mean that you had to worry about whether he was the Son of God or not.
Okay, all right, last question. How do you love people who live lifestyles considered unnatural?
I grew up in New York City. What lifestyle would I consider unnatural? How do you love people whose lifestyles you consider unnatural? Well, again, we've got to remember what love is. Let me just go back to that to end. Loving someone doesn't mean necessarily liking them. Loving someone doesn't even mean accepting or improving or endorsing everything they do. Loving someone means compassion in that sense of an active desire to relate and to empathize, suffer with, engage with that person. I think love can absolutely mean disagreement or criticism, but it's how the criticism and the disagreement happen. I mean, out of what is it being given? If it is being out of compassion, then it is, then to me it is still love. And so, lifestyles, okay, I should say there are lifestyles. They're highly selfish. Usually that's meant to mean sexually deviant lifestyles. Well, for me, probably the lifestyles that I disapprove are highly materialistic and highly selfish and me first sort of thinking. And absolutely, I do feel I'm enjoined to love them, but that doesn't mean I'm enjoined to agree with everything they do or just let them do what they're going to do. The love doesn't mean that. Now I'm going to go to Martin Luther King. When Martin Luther King talked about loving your enemy, that wasn't like, hey guys, you all can just keep oppressing us. That's fine. No, love was about resisting the evil in the structures And love was about being critical, but it was doing it in a compassionate, not a nonviolent way. And I think that's the way I would hope I would deal with towards people who do not. Funnily enough, I was just thinking about this today, talking with a student about how to deal with, in my own political understanding, with white people who voted for Donald Trump. A man who has declared, who seems to be indicating some negative views of all sorts of people. And how do we do that in some kind of compassion, but also saying, you know, you're not seeing things. I think that's a hard task, and that's probably one a lot of us have ahead of us.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
That's great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, great. Well, I really